The old Hendricks property had been sitting empty for nearly 40 years when Raymond Price finally found the courage to buy it. The farmhouse had collapsed in on itself decades ago, leaving nothing but a pile of rotting timber and broken memories. The barn had fared slightly better, its walls still standing, though its roof had given way to time and weather. And behind both structures, hidden by decades of overgrown vegetation, stood a workshop that everyone in the small town of Millbrook, Indiana, had forgotten even existed. Raymond was 65 years old, a retired Air Force Master Sergeant who had spent 30 years maintaining aircraft for the United States military. He had worked on everything from F-16 Fighting Falcons to C-130 transport planes, had kept birds in the air during Desert Storm and Iraqi Freedom, and a dozen smaller conflicts that never made the evening news. His hands bore the calluses and scars of a lifetime spent with tools and machinery, and his mind held an encyclopedic knowledge of aviation that few living people could match. He had come home to Millbrook after his retirement 3 years ago, returning to the small Indiana town where he had grown up and where his parents were buried in the cemetery on the hill overlooking Main Street. The town had changed during his decades away, shrinking as young people left for opportunities in Indianapolis or Chicago and never came back. But the bones of the place remained the same, the grid of streets and the white church steeple and the fields of corn and soybeans that stretched to the horizon in every direction. Raymond had bought a small house on the edge of town, a modest 2-bedroom that was more space than he needed but less than he could afford. His Air Force pension was generous, and he had saved carefully throughout his career, knowing that someday he would want to settle down somewhere quiet and live out his remaining years in peace. Millbrook was that place, the only place that had ever truly felt like home, despite all the years he had spent wandering the world in service to his country. The Hendricks property had caught his attention almost immediately after his return. It sat on 20 acres at the end of a dirt road, its boundaries marked by ancient oak trees and crumbling stone walls that dated back to before the Civil War. The family that had owned it was long gone, their name surviving only on a few headstones in the cemetery and in the memories of the oldest residents who could still remember when the Hendricks farm had been one of the most prosperous in the county. Something about the property called to Raymond, drew him down that dirt road again and again, despite having no reason to be there. He would park his truck at the edge of the overgrown fields and walk through the tall grass, exploring the ruins of buildings that had once housed a family and their dreams. He found old equipment rusting in the weeds, fragments of machinery that spoke of a farming operation that had once been sophisticated for its time. He found the foundation of the farmhouse, its stones still solid despite the decades of neglect. And he found the workshop, nearly invisible behind a wall of vegetation that had grown up around it like a protective shell. The workshop was what convinced him to buy the property. It was a substantial structure, perhaps 40 feet by 60, built of concrete blocks with a metal roof that had somehow survived the years better than any other building on the property. The windows were intact, protected by metal shutters that had been pulled closed and locked from the inside. And the door, a heavy steel affair that belonged more on a bank vault than a farm workshop, was secured with a padlock that had rusted solid in its hasp. Raymond had no idea what was inside. The county records showed only that the building had been constructed in 1946, 1 year after the end of World War II. There were no permits for specific uses, no inspections recorded, no indication of what the Hendricks family had needed a building this substantial for. It was a mystery, and Raymond had always loved mysteries. The purchase took 6 months to complete, complicated by unclear title issues and the need to track down distant heirs who had scattered across the country over the decades. But Raymond was patient, had learned patience during 30 years of military service, where hurrying often meant making mistakes that could cost lives. He waited, he negotiated, he signed the papers when they were finally ready. And on a cool October morning, 3 years after his return to Millbrook, he became the owner of the old Hendricks property. He brought Ace with him when he went to take possession. Ace was a Belgian Malinois, 8 years old, a former military working dog who had served 2 tours in Afghanistan before a leg injury had forced his retirement. Raymond had adopted him through a program that matched retired working dogs with veterans, and from the moment they had met at the shelter in Texas, something had clicked between them. They were both old soldiers, both carrying scars from their service, both looking for a place to finally rest. The dog was magnificent, despite his age and his limp. His coat was the classic fawn color of his breed, darker around his muzzle and ears, with intelligent brown eyes that seemed to take in everything around him. He had been trained to detect explosives, to attack on command, to protect his handler with his life if necessary. But in retirement, he had become something gentler, a companion who seemed to understand Raymond's moods and respond to them with uncanny accuracy.
They walked the property together that first morning, Raymond with a pair of bolt cutters in his hand, and Ace ranging ahead with his nose close to the ground. The dog seemed energized by the new environment, his limp less pronounced as he explored the overgrown fields and the ruins of buildings that had stood empty for so long. Raymond watched him with a smile, grateful for the companionship that had helped him through the difficult transition from military life to civilian retirement.
The workshop was their destination, the mystery that had driven Raymond to purchase this property in the first place. He approached it slowly, savoring the anticipation, wondering what he would find inside after 40 years of abandonment. The vegetation had been cleared away during the months of negotiation, revealing the full extent of the structure for the first time.
It was larger than he had realized, built with a care and precision that suggested it had been important to whoever had constructed it.
The padlock yielded to the bolt cutters with a satisfying snap, falling to the ground in pieces. Raymond pulled the heavy door open, its hinges protesting with a screech that echoed across the empty property. Stale air rushed out, carrying with it the smell of dust and old oil, and something else, something mechanical that Raymond recognized instantly from his decades of working on aircraft. Aviation fuel. The workshop smelled of aviation fuel. He stepped inside, his eyes adjusting slowly to the darkness, and felt his breath catch in his throat. The workshop was not empty. It was not abandoned. It was filled with something that Raymond's mind struggled to process, something that seemed impossible in a small farming community in rural Indiana. There was an airplane inside, a complete, intact World War II-era fighter plane, sitting in the shadows as if it had been waiting for someone to come and find it. Raymond stood frozen in the doorway, unable to move, unable to think. He had spent his entire career working on aircraft, had seen planes of every type and era during his 30 years of service. But he had never seen anything like this, had never expected to find a piece of aviation history hidden in a workshop on a forgotten farm in the middle of Indiana. Ace had no such hesitation. The dog bounded into the workshop, his nose working overtime, exploring the space with the enthusiasm of a creature who had found something interesting. He circled the aircraft, sniffing at the landing gear, investigating the shadows behind the wings, finally sitting down near the nose and looking back at Raymond as if to ask what was taking so long. Raymond forced himself to move, to approach the aircraft with the reverence it deserved. As he got closer, he began to recognize what he was looking at, began to understand the magnitude of what he had discovered. The P-51 was one of the most iconic aircraft of World War II, a single-seat fighter that had helped the Allies achieve air superiority over Europe in the final years of the conflict. It was fast, maneuverable, and deadly, with a range that allowed it to escort bombers deep into German territory and return safely to base. Pilots loved it, historians revered it, and collectors would pay almost anything to get their hands on one. But this wasn't just any P-51. As Raymond circled the aircraft, as his eyes adjusted to the dim light, and he began to see details, he realized that he was looking at something even more special. The plane was in remarkable condition, far better than it had any right to be after sitting in a workshop for decades. The paint was faded but still visible, showing the distinctive markings of a specific unit. The canopy was intact, the propeller blades straight and true, the landing gear solid. Someone had taken care of this aircraft, had preserved it with the attention to detail that only a true aviation enthusiast would understand. And there was something else, something that made Raymond's heart beat faster as he recognized it. Beneath the cockpit, faded but still legible, was a name painted in flowing script. Lucky Lady. Raymond knew that name. Every aviation historian knew that name. Lucky Lady was one of the most famous P-51 Mustangs of World War II, flown by an ace named Captain William Hendricks, who had shot down 17 German aircraft before being killed in action in March 1945.
The plane had been damaged in the same engagement that killed its pilot and had been reported as destroyed, one of the countless aircraft lost in the final desperate months of the European Air War.
But here it was, sitting in a workshop in Indiana, intact and preserved for nearly 80 years. Raymond sank to his knees, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he had discovered. Ace came to him immediately, pressing against his side, offering the silent comfort that had sustained Raymond through so many difficult moments. The man wrapped his arms around the dog and held on, tears streaming down his face as he tried to process what he was seeing. He had found Lucky Lady. He had found one of the most sought-after missing aircraft in aviation history, and he had no idea how it had ended up here, in a workshop on a farm that had once been owned by a family named Hendricks. Wait, Hendricks. The pilot who had flown Lucky Lady was named William Hendricks. The family who had owned this farm was named Hendricks. Could it be a coincidence? Or was there a connection? A story that would explain how this legendary aircraft had ended up hidden away in rural Indiana. Raymond knew he needed to find out. But first, he needed to document what he had found, to make sure that the discovery was properly recorded before word got out and the inevitable circus descended. He pulled out his phone and began taking photographs, capturing every angle of the aircraft, every detail that might help establish its authenticity. Ace watched with patient curiosity, occasionally sniffing at the plane, as if he too understood that they had found something important. The investigation that followed consumed the next several months of Raymond's life. He contacted aviation historians, military archivists, and experts in World War II aircraft restoration. He tracked down every piece of documentation he could find about Lucky Lady and Captain William Hendricks. And slowly, painstakingly, he pieced together a story that was even more remarkable than he had imagined. Captain William Hendricks had indeed been the pilot of Lucky Lady, one of the top American aces of World War II. He had grown up on the very farm where Raymond had found the aircraft, had learned to fly in the fields that now lay fallow and overgrown. When the war came, he had enlisted immediately, driven by patriotism and a love of aviation that had defined him since childhood. His service record was exemplary. 17 confirmed kills, multiple commendations for bravery, a reputation among his fellow pilots as one of the best in the business. He had been credited with protecting countless bombers during raids over Germany, with saving the lives of crew members who would otherwise have been shot down by enemy fighters. Lucky Lady had been his constant companion, the aircraft that had carried him through dozens of missions and brought him home safely every time. The official record stated that Captain Hendricks had been killed in action during an escort mission over Germany, his aircraft destroyed by enemy fire. But the documentation Raymond uncovered told a different story. Lucky Lady had been damaged but not destroyed, had managed to limp back to an Allied airfield in France where it had been deemed too badly damaged to repair. The decision had been made to scrap it, to salvage what parts could be used and destroy the rest. But someone had intervened. Someone had pulled strings, called in favors, done whatever was necessary to save the aircraft from destruction. The records were murky, obscured by the chaos of the war's final months, but Raymond was able to piece together enough to understand what had happened. Captain Hendricks had a brother, a younger sibling named Thomas, who had been deemed medically unfit for combat due to a childhood illness that had left him with a weakened heart. Thomas had remained on the family farm during the war, maintaining the operation and waiting for his brother to come home. When word came that William had been killed, Thomas had been devastated. And when he learned that Lucky Lady was scheduled for destruction, he had moved heaven and earth to prevent it. The details of how Thomas had managed to acquire the aircraft and transport it from France to Indiana remained unclear. Raymond suspected that money had changed hands, that favors had been called in, that rules had been bent if not outright broken. But somehow, against all odds, the damaged P-51 had been disassembled, shipped across the Atlantic, and reassembled in the workshop that Thomas had built specifically to house it. The workshop's construction date of 1946 suddenly made sense. Thomas had built it to hold his brother's aircraft, to preserve the machine that William had loved and that represented everything he had fought and died for. And then, for reasons that Raymond could only guess at, he had sealed the workshop and never opened it again. Thomas Hendricks had lived until 1983, maintaining the farm and the workshop for nearly 40 years. He had never married, never had children, never spoken to anyone about what was hidden in the building behind the barn. When he died, the property had passed to distant relatives who had shown no interest in it, leaving it to decay until Raymond had come along and seen something worth saving. The discovery of Lucky Lady's provenance transformed the find from remarkable to extraordinary. This wasn't just a well-preserved P-51 Mustang. This was a direct connection to one of the great heroes of World War II, a machine that had been saved by brotherly love and preserved for decades in a tribute that no one had known about until now. The experts who came to examine the aircraft confirmed its authenticity and assessed its condition. Lucky Lady was in remarkable shape, they reported, far better than most aircraft that had been sitting in museums for decades. Thomas had clearly maintained it over the years, protecting it from moisture and pests, preserving its mechanical systems with the care of someone who understood its value. With proper restoration, they believed, Lucky Lady could fly again. The valuation came as a shock even to Raymond, who had expected the aircraft to be valuable. The combination of Lucky Lady's historical significance, its excellent condition, and its romantic backstory made it one of the most desirable pieces of aviation memorabilia in the world. At auction, the experts estimated, it could fetch anywhere from $75 to $100 million. $100 million. Raymond sat with that number for days, trying to make it real in his mind. He had bought the Hendricks property for less than $50,000, a bargain price for 20 acres that everyone assumed were worthless. And now he was sitting on a fortune that exceeded anything he had ever imagined. But the money wasn't what consumed his thoughts. What consumed him was the story, the incredible tale of two brothers separated by war and united by an aircraft that had somehow survived against all odds. William, the hero who had given his life for his country. Thomas, the brother who had devoted his remaining years to preserving William's legacy. And Lucky Lady, the machine that had connected them across the gulf of death and time. Raymond felt a responsibility to honor that story, to ensure that the aircraft and everything it represented were treated with the respect they deserved. He could sell Lucky Lady, could take the money and live out his remaining years in luxury, but something about that felt wrong, felt like a betrayal of the brothers who had loved this plane and what it stood for. Ace seemed to sense his turmoil. The dog stayed close during the days of deliberation, pressing against Raymond's leg when he sat lost in thought, accompanying him on long walks through the property where Lucky Lady had been hidden for so long. There was wisdom in the dog's patience, a reminder that some decisions couldn't be rushed, that the right path would reveal itself in time. The breakthrough came when Raymond discovered the letters. He had been searching the workshop for additional documentation, hoping to find records that might shed more light on Thomas's preservation efforts. Instead, he found a metal box hidden beneath the floorboards, protected from moisture by multiple layers of oilcloth. Inside were letters, dozens of them, correspondence between the brothers that dated from William's deployment in 1943 to his death in 1945. Raymond read them slowly, savoring each one, feeling as if he were eavesdropping on a private conversation between two men who had been dead for decades. The letters revealed a relationship that was deeper and more complex than the historical record had suggested. William had relied on Thomas for emotional support during the hardest days of the war, had shared fears and doubts that he could never express to his fellow soldiers. And Thomas had responded with encouragement and love, assuring his brother that he was doing important work and that everyone at home was proud of him. The final letter, dated March 10, 1945, just 5 days before William's death, was the most poignant. William wrote about Lucky Lady, about his deep attachment to the aircraft that had become his constant companion in the skies over Europe. He described the plane as if it were a living thing, praising its responsiveness and reliability, thanking it for bringing him home safely time after time. "If anything happens to me," William wrote, "I hope someone will take care of Lucky Lady. She deserves better than to be scrapped and forgotten. She's been my partner through everything, and I can't bear the thought of her ending up in a junkyard somewhere." Thomas had fulfilled that wish beyond anything William could have imagined. He had saved the aircraft, had devoted his life to preserving it, had kept it hidden and protected for nearly 40 years. And now, through the unlikely chain of events that had led Raymond to the Hendricks property, the world would finally know the story. Raymond made his decision. He wouldn't sell Lucky Lady. Instead, he would donate it to the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum, where it could be displayed alongside other legendary aircraft of World War II. The museum would tell the story of William and Thomas Hendricks, would honor both the hero who had flown the plane and the brother who had saved it. And millions of visitors would learn about the bond between two men that had transcended death and time. The announcement of the donation generated a media frenzy that dwarfed anything Raymond had anticipated. News outlets around the world covered the story, captivated by the combination of aviation history, wartime heroism, and brotherly devotion. Raymond found himself giving interviews to major newspapers and television networks, telling and retelling the story of how he had discovered Lucky Lady in an abandoned workshop in rural Indiana. But he always made sure to include Ace in the narrative. It was the dog, after all, who had been eager to explore the workshop, who had bounded inside without hesitation when Raymond was still frozen in the doorway. Ace had been the first to approach the aircraft, the first to circle it with curious interest, the first to sit beside it, as if recognizing that they had found something important. The story of the veteran and his dog became almost as popular as the story of the aircraft itself. People loved the image of the retired Air Force Master Sergeant and his Belgian Malinois partner, two old soldiers who had stumbled onto one of the greatest aviation discoveries of the century. They sent letters and emails expressing their appreciation, sharing their own stories of dogs who had led them to unexpected discoveries, celebrating the bond between humans and animals that had made the find possible. The restoration of Lucky Lady took 3 years, a painstaking process that involved some of the most skilled aviation technicians in the world. Every component was examined, documented, and either preserved or replaced according to strict historical standards. The original paint scheme was carefully restored, including the name Lucky Lady beneath the cockpit and the symbols representing Captain Hendricks' 17 confirmed kills. The engine was rebuilt to working condition, allowing the aircraft to be flown from Indiana to Washington, D.C. for its final installation. Raymond was there when Lucky Lady took to the skies for the first time in nearly 80 years. He watched from the edge of the runway, Ace at his side, tears streaming down his face as the restored Mustang lifted off and climbed into the blue Indiana sky. The sound of the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine was unmistakable, a throaty roar that had once struck fear into the hearts of German pilots, and now served as a tribute to the men who had flown and maintained these remarkable machines. Ace barked once as the plane passed overhead, a sound that might have been appreciation or simply excitement at the noise and commotion. Raymond reached down and scratched behind the dog's ears, grateful for the companion who had been with him through every step of this journey. "We did it, boy," he said softly. "We found her and we saved her. William and Thomas would be proud." The display at the Smithsonian opened to enormous crowds, with visitors lining up for hours to see the legendary aircraft that had been hidden for so long. The museum had created a comprehensive exhibit that told the full story, from Captain Hendricks' wartime service to Thomas's decades of preservation to Raymond's discovery in the abandoned workshop. There were photographs and documents, personal effects and military records, everything needed to help visitors understand the significance of what they were seeing. A special section of the exhibit was devoted to Raymond and Ace, acknowledging their role in bringing Lucky Lady back to the world. There were photographs of them at the workshop, standing beside the aircraft in the days after the discovery. There was a video interview where Raymond told the story in his own words, describing the moment when he had first recognized what he was looking at. And there was a sculpture of Ace, commissioned by the museum to honor the dog who had been so eager to explore the mysterious workshop. The attention was overwhelming for a man who had spent most of his life avoiding the spotlight. But Raymond understood that the story was bigger than himself, that it belonged to William and Thomas Hendricks, and to everyone who had ever loved aviation or appreciated the sacrifices of those who had served in World War II. He accepted the invitations to speak at events and schools, sharing the story with audiences who were always moved by the tale of brotherly love that had preserved Lucky Lady across the decades. Ace came with him to many of these events, a calming presence that helped Raymond manage the anxiety that public speaking still generated. The dog seemed to enjoy the attention, accepting pets and praise from admirers with the dignified grace that characterized his breed. Children especially loved him, asking to take pictures with the famous dog who would help discover the $100 million airplane. The value of the discovery remained a topic of conversation, though Raymond had never received a penny from it. By donating Lucky Lady to the Smithsonian rather than selling it, he had given away a fortune that would have set him up for life, and probably for several lifetimes after that. People often asked if he regretted the decision, if he ever wished he had taken the money instead. His answer was always the same. Some things were more important than money. William Hendricks had given his life for his country, had died in the skies over Germany fighting against tyranny and evil. Thomas Hendricks had devoted his remaining years to preserving his brother's legacy, had kept Lucky Lady hidden and protected when everyone assumed it had been destroyed. The least Raymond could do was ensure that their sacrifice and their devotion were properly honored. Besides, he always added with a smile, he had Ace, and that was worth more than any amount of money. The years that followed the discovery were the happiest of Raymond's life. He remained in Millbrook, maintaining the modest house he had bought after his retirement, walking the Hendricks property with Ace, and remembering the moment when everything had changed. The workshop still stood, preserved now as a historical site that told the story of where Lucky Lady had been hidden. Visitors came from around the country to see it, to stand in the space where the aircraft had sat for decades, to feel the presence of history in the air around them. Raymond became a minor celebrity in the aviation community, invited to speak at air shows and museum events, consulted by historians working on books about World War II. He accepted these invitations selectively, preferring the quiet life in Millbrook to the demands of public attention. But when he did speak, he always made sure to tell the complete story, honoring the Hendricks brothers and the aircraft that had connected them across time.
Ace aged gracefully, his muzzle turning white and his limp becoming more pronounced as the years passed. But his spirit remained strong, his eyes still bright with the intelligence that had characterized him since Raymond had first met him at the shelter in Texas. They continued their daily walks through the Hendricks property, moving more slowly now, but still covering the ground where their adventure had begun.
When Ace finally passed away at the age of 14, Raymond buried him on the Hendricks property, not far from the workshop where they had discovered Lucky Lady. The grave was marked with a simple stone that read, Ace, he led the way. Raymond stood at the grave for a long time after the burial, remembering all the moments they had shared. The discovery in the workshop, the media appearances, the trips to the Smithsonian to see Lucky Lady in her new home, the quiet evenings on the porch, watching the sunset over the Indiana fields. Ace had been there through all of it, the faithful companion who had made solitary retirement bearable. The grief was familiar. Raymond had lost friends and colleagues throughout his military career, had learned to carry the weight of loss without letting it crush him. But losing Ace was different somehow, more personal, more immediate. The dog had been his partner in civilian life, the one who had helped him transition from the structured world of the Air Force to the uncertain territory of retirement. Without him, the house felt empty in a way it never had before. But Raymond knew that Ace would want him to keep going, to continue living the purposeful life they had built together. So he did. He adopted another dog, a German shepherd named Captain, who reminded him of Ace in some ways and was completely different in others. He continued his work with the aviation community, sharing the story of Lucky Lady with new audiences. And he maintained the Hendricks property, ensuring that the workshop and the story it told would be preserved for future generations. The discovery had changed Raymond's life in ways he never could have anticipated. He had gone from a lonely retiree searching for meaning to a minor celebrity whose story had touched millions. He had found purpose in honoring the memory of two brothers he had never met, had become the steward of a legacy that extended far beyond his own small existence. And he had learned, through the unexpected discovery of an abandoned workshop and the treasure it contained, that life could surprise you at any age if you were open to its possibilities. The Smithsonian continued to update the Lucky Lady exhibit over the years, adding new information as researchers uncovered additional details about the Hendricks brothers and their remarkable story. Raymond consulted on these updates, sharing his insights and ensuring that the narrative remained accurate and respectful. The exhibit became one of the most popular at the museum, drawing visitors who wanted to see not just a historic aircraft, but a testament to the power of love and dedication. On the 10th anniversary of the discovery, the museum held a special event honoring Raymond and the Hendrix brothers. Dignitaries and aviation enthusiasts gathered to celebrate the legacy that had been preserved against all odds. Raymond spoke briefly, thanking everyone who had helped make the discovery and preservation possible. But he devoted most of his remarks to William and Thomas, to the brothers whose love for each other had saved an irreplaceable piece of history. "I was just the guy who bought the property," Raymond said, his voice steady despite the emotion that threatened to overwhelm him. "William was the hero who flew Lucky Lady into battle. Thomas was the devoted brother who saved her from destruction. And Ace was the curious dog who led me into the workshop when I was still frozen at the door. The credit belongs to all of them, not to me."
The applause that followed was long and heartfelt, a tribute to the modest man who had given away a fortune to honor two brothers he had never known. Raymond accepted it with the same grace he had shown throughout his life, grateful for the recognition, but uncomfortable with the attention.
That evening, after the crowds had dispersed and the museum had closed, Raymond walked alone through the exhibit. He stood before Lucky Lady, looking up at the aircraft that had changed everything, remembering the moment when he had first recognized what he was seeing in that dusty workshop. The plane looked beautiful in the museum lighting, its restored paint gleaming, its deadly grace on full display. It was hard to imagine it hidden in darkness for 40 years, waiting for someone to come and find it. But that was the story, the remarkable truth that had captured the world's imagination and given Raymond a purpose he had never expected to find. He thought about William, the young pilot who had died in the skies over Germany, fighting for a cause he believed in. He thought about Thomas, the devoted brother who had spent his life preserving William's legacy. And he thought about Ace, the Belgian Malinois who had bounded into the workshop without hesitation, who had led the way when Raymond couldn't move. They were all connected now, their stories intertwined through the aircraft that stood before him. The pilot, the brother, the veteran, the dog. Each had played a role in preserving Lucky Lady and ensuring that she would be remembered for generations to come. Raymond reached out and touched the wing of the aircraft, feeling the smooth metal beneath his fingers. It was cool and solid, a tangible reminder of everything that had happened. "Thank you," he whispered, speaking to all of them, to William and Thomas and Ace and everyone else who had made this moment possible. "Thank you for trusting me with your story." The museum security guard found him there an hour later, still standing before the aircraft, lost in memories and gratitude. She approached quietly, not wanting to disturb him, but Raymond sensed her presence and turned. "Sorry," he said, offering a sheepish smile. "I lost track of time." "Take as long as you need, Mr. Price," the guard replied. "This is your airplane in a way. You earned the right to spend time with it." Raymond shook his head. "It's not mine. It belongs to William and Thomas Hendrix. It belongs to everyone who ever flew a P-51 into combat. It belongs to history." He took one last look at Lucky Lady, at the aircraft that had emerged from the darkness of an abandoned workshop to take its rightful place in the pantheon of American aviation history. Then he walked away, leaving her to the care of the museum and the admiration of generations to come. Outside, the Washington night was cool and clear, the stars visible even through the city lights. Raymond looked up at them, thinking about all the pilots who had navigated by those same stars during the war, who had flown through darkness and danger to protect the world from tyranny. He was 78 years old now, closer to the end than the beginning, but he felt at peace in a way he hadn't when he first returned to Millbrook, when retirement had seemed like a slow descent into irrelevance. The discovery of Lucky Lady had given him purpose, had connected him to something larger than himself, and the bonds he had formed, with Ace and with the memory of the Hendrix brothers, would sustain him for whatever time remained. Raymond Price walked away from the museum with his head held high, an old soldier who had found one more mission to complete. The abandoned workshop had yielded its secret, the fortune had been given to the nation, and the story of Lucky Lady would be told for as long as there were people who remembered the sacrifices of World War II. All because a dog had been eager to explore, had bounded into darkness when his human was still hesitating at the door. All because an 8-year-old Belgian Malinois named Ace had led the way to a discovery that would change everything.
That was the power of the bond between human and animal, the mysterious connection that could transform lives in unexpected ways. Raymond had learned to trust that bond, had followed Ace into the workshop and into a future he never could have imagined. And the reward had been greater than any fortune, greater than any recognition.
The reward had been purpose. The reward had been meaning. The reward had been the privilege of telling a story that deserved to be told. Lucky Lady sat in the Smithsonian, her story preserved for generations. William and Thomas Hendricks were remembered, their sacrifice and devotion honored by millions of visitors. And Raymond Price, the retired master sergeant who had stumbled onto history, could rest easy knowing that he had done right by all of them. That was the true fortune hidden in plain sight. Not the $100 million the aircraft was worth, but the legacy of love and duty that it represented. That legacy was priceless, beyond any calculation of value, and Raymond was proud to have played a role in preserving it. He hailed a taxi and gave the driver the address of his hotel. Tomorrow he would fly back to Indiana, to the small house in Millbrook where Captain was waiting for him. He would walk the Hendricks property, would visit Ace's grave, would remember all the moments that had led to this night. And he would be grateful, as he was every day, for the curious dog who had led him to the abandoned workshop and the treasure it contained. The treasure that had been hiding in plain sight for nearly 80 years, waiting for someone to come and find it. Waiting for Ace to lead the way.